Hello, welcome to the History Sphere. My name is Greg. I am your host. This is my all new podcast. It is the first of what I hope will be many, many episodes. On November 7th, 1841, a ship called the Creole, a two-masted brig, came to a stop, or to use the sailing term, heaved to off the coast of Florida, about 200 miles northeast of Miami. It was the dead of night. The sea was quiet. Most of the ship was asleep. There were no lights lit on board the ship, save for one lantern at the bow. First mate Zephaniah Gifford was on watch. On board the ship, in addition to the first mate, were the captain, Robert Enser, his wife, his 4-year-old daughter, his 15-year-old niece, about a dozen crewmen and passengers, crates of tobacco, and 135 enslaved human beings. The Creole was a slave ship on the coastwise slave trade, transporting this cargo of enslaved human beings from Richmond, Virginia, to the slave markets of New Orleans. This coastwise slave trade had grown up in the aftermath of Congress abolishing the international slave trade, that is, the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808. As the country grew and expanded westward, particularly into the Southwest, into the Mississippi Valley, Americans brought the institution of slavery with them, as well as in New Orleans, where it had existed prior to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 under French and Spanish rule, but was much expanded as Americans moved into the area and brought their slaves with them. As American settlers moved into the Mississippi Valley, they carved out massive cotton and sugar plantations, which became the basis of the region's economy, especially after the invention of the modern cotton gin, which made cotton much more profitable to produce and cheaper to produce. It made it economically viable to mass produce, and the demand for slave labor for these massive cotton plantations in the Mississippi Valley would only grow. It was a boost to the trade that there was largely a surplus of slave labor in eastern states like Virginia and Maryland, because the crops being grown there, like tobacco, were less labor intensive than the cotton and sugar being grown in Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley. Along with the outlawing of the international slave trade, which made domestically held slaves roughly 3 times as valuable. So this was an immensely profitable trade that transported these enslaved people from the southeastern United States, places like Richmond, Virginia, to the slave markets of New Orleans, where they were purchased by slave traders who would move them up and down the Mississippi Valley and the American Southwest, and thereby spread slavery into that region and cement slavery as an integral part, not only of the economy, but of the society. When you think of a slave ship, if you're like me, you probably think of the horrible, inhumane conditions that people were kept under during the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, of course, being the passage from the West African coast to the Western Hemisphere. These ships on the Middle Passage were the pinnacle of the brutality of the slave system. Millions are thought to have died. We'll never know the true number. They were kept chained below deck, just treated with the absolute highest degree of brutality possible. When you picture a ship like the Creole on the coastwise slave trade, don't get me wrong. These people were still dehumanized and treated as property rather than people. But the conditions were less cruel and less brutal. There seems to have been an assumption by the people running this trade, the white enslavers that were running this trade, that people who had been born into slavery were less likely to try and rise up and assert their freedom and their liberty by force. And so the kinds of measures that were needed to control them didn't need to be as harsh on these ships. So for instance, on the Creole, the captives were not chained below deck. They were locked in the cargo hold at night, and they were separated by sex. The men were in one cargo hold, the women were in another. They weren't allowed to intermingle, especially at night. But aside from that, during the day, most of them had some freedom to move around the ship. Indeed, several of them had been given jobs on the ship. These would have been enslaved men and women who were more trusted by the white captain and crew to, for lack of a better term, to know their place and to be grateful for the relative privilege that they were being given of being allowed to move freely about the ship and perform these jobs. One such person was Madison Washington, a 22-year-old man who was the ship's cook. And he's going to figure prominently into this story. One of the main rules that they had to follow was that men were not allowed to enter the women's hold, women were not allowed in the men's hold. I assume this was to prevent unauthorized relations between the men and the women. On the night of November 7th, 1841, as First Mate Zephaniah Gifford was on watch, he was approached by an enslaved man, Elijah Morris. Morris told him that there was a young man in the women's hold where he wasn't supposed to be. It seems likely that Morris was one of these men that was in a more privileged position among those enslaved on the Creole. He seems to have been out of the cargo hold at night and trusted enough by Gifford that when he approached Gifford and told him this story, that Gifford believed him. Gifford went and got one of the passengers who had been hired as a man to help oversee the slaves on the voyage, a man named John Huell. And together they followed Morris to the women's hold to investigate. It's unclear exactly what unfolded from there. What is clear from the testimony from later investigations is that this was a trap, that Morris was intentionally leading them into an ambush, and that Madison Washington, the aforementioned ship's cook, was waiting for them. And as he set upon them, a gunshot rang out, fired by Elijah Morris. It grazed the back of First Mate Gifford's head. That was the signal for the revolt to begin. Madison Washington, Elijah Morris, and 16 other men enslaved on the Creole rose up in a frenzy of intense but organized violence. Gifford, after being grazed by a bullet in the back of the head, was aware enough and lucky enough to be able to extricate himself from the melee and retreat to the captain's quarters to wake the captain. John Huell was not so lucky. John Huell was set upon by enslaved men wielding knives. He was reportedly stabbed about 24 times. According to later witness testimony, he was so severely hacked that he was nearly beheaded. And yet, still alive, and with some presence of mind, he managed to pick himself up and wander below deck to one of the cabins where he died. As the revolt intensified, the violence continued as Madison Washington and the rebels pushed their way towards the back of the ship where the captain's quarters were. In a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide, Captain Ensor emerged from his quarters with a loaded musket and attempted to fire on the rebellious slaves. His musket misfired, and he was immediately set upon by knife-wielding rebels who stabbed him approximately 20 times. He was severely wounded, but for the time being remained alive. The first mate, Gifford, still alive and in possession of his senses, managed to drag the captain up into the rigging, where they both hid for the rest of the voyage, and he did his best to treat Captain Ensor's wounds. At this point, it was just mopping up. The rebels moved around the ship, rounding up all of the white crewmen and passengers and bringing them on deck. It seems from later witness accounts that some of the men wanted to kill the white crew and passengers or to harm them in some way, and that Madison Washington, who, by all accounts, was the mastermind and the leader of this revolt, stepped in to prevent further violence. We don't know much about Madison Washington's backstory before these events. In fact, we really don't know anything. All we know is that he was 22 years old, male, and he was the ship's cook, and he was one of the captives on the ship, property of one Thomas McCargo. In 1852, Frederick Douglass published a novel called The Heroic Slave, about a fictional version of Madison, Washington, complete with this very captivating backstory of how he escaped to Canada and he was home free. He had left Virginia, escaped to Canada, but through tragic circumstance, he had been forced to leave his wife, the love of his life, behind in slavery. And so he risked everything in the name of love to go back for her. And when he went back to Virginia, he was tragically captured and sold into slavery along this coastwise slave trade. And that served as part of his motivation to assert his freedom and to take revenge on those who had stolen his life and his love from him. It's a very heroic tale, and it gives all this backstory and all this information that it's likely, because it was a work of fiction, Frederick Douglass likely made this up whole cloth, this whole backstory and motivation. We really don't know anything about Madison, Washington, unfortunately. And it's not that I hold that against Douglass for making this up. He was writing a piece of fiction, not a historical documentary. It was meant as a novel to intentionally heroicize this uprising. What I do believe, and these are my observations, or these are my conclusions based on what I observe about Madison, Washington. He seems to have been highly intelligent and strategically minded. He had the foresight to understand, once the ship was in their control, how they behaved after that, and the perception of the revolt was almost as important as whether the revolt was successful. As I mentioned before, he was the ship's cook, which was a relatively privileged position. It was not only a position of privilege, but he had to have been at least somewhat trusted by the captain and crew to be put in that position, because in addition to giving him access to knives and other kitchen implements, which is likely where many of the knives wielded by the rebellious slaves when the uprising happened came from, it also gave him the opportunity to interact with everyone on board the ship, both white and black. And during that time period between October 25th and November 7th, he was observing and planning. He learned who he could trust among those enslaved on the ship, who he could include in his plan to seize their freedom and their liberty. Not only that, but he learned the schedules and the habits of the white captain and crew and passengers, where they would be at certain times. For that reason, it's likely he knew that at that time of night on November 7th, that First Mate Gifford would be on watch and the rest of the ship would be asleep, and that was an opportune time to launch the uprising. Essentially, it gave him this position from which he could successfully plan this revolt. Using this position and his strategic thinking skills, he hatched a plot with 18 other enslaved men aboard the ship to take back their freedom and their liberty by force and assert their own freedom and the freedom of the other people enslaved on board the Creole. By the end of the night, Madison, Washington, and his cohort were in control of the ship. The only question remaining was what to do now. At this point, I want to take a step back and talk about the wider context that all of this happened in, specifically the politics of slavery in the United States in 1841. By the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, slavery was on its way out in the North, where once both North and South there had been laws protecting and legitimizing the institution of race-based chattel slavery. In the 1780s and 90s, most northern states had enacted laws to either abolish or phase out slavery. This process was well underway by 1840. There were still some people enslaved in northern states in the 1840s. When we look at the 1840 census data, for instance, there were hundreds of slaves still in New Jersey. The state of New York had a slave population of 4. So it was basically abolished. It was done gradually. People could no longer be born into slavery, and it was being phased out. New northern states never had slavery at all. States like Ohio, Michigan, or Illinois, as the country moved westward, new northern states prohibited slavery from the beginning. South of the Mason-Dixon line is a different story altogether. Slavery was thriving and growing, especially after 1794 with the advent of the cotton gin, which I talked about before. Slavery was a primary issue of contention at the Constitutional Convention. You had some northern delegates that wanted to do away with slavery and phase it out nationwide, which was completely unacceptable to the southern delegates. You had some delegates from the South, especially the Deep South, states like South Carolina and Georgia, who wanted not only to continue slavery, but to enshrine it into national law and explicitly protect the institution of what they called African slavery as completely legitimate and explicitly protected in the United States Constitution. And you had a majority of delegates from the North and the South who just wanted to come to an agreement. They didn't want to deal with slavery. They didn't want to make that the issue of the day. They understood that in order to have a constitution that formed a union between the northern and southern states, slavery would have to be tolerated. However, most delegates to the Constitutional Convention did not want to do what some southern delegates from the Deep South, like I mentioned, wanted to do and enshrine it into national law. And so what we ended up with instead were a series of compromises. And in those compromises, you can look at the Constitution today. Prior to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the word slavery does not appear once in the United States Constitution. Instead, when we talk about the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise, for instance, they refer to all other persons, excluding Indians not taxed. And when we talk about the equally infamous Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, they use the words persons bound to service. I think that's important, the language that is used there. Because while it does provide a clause to the Constitution that was extremely accommodating to the practice of slavery and ensured that runaway slaves could not seek refuge in free states from slave catchers who could lawfully return them to slavery in states where it was legal, the language in the Constitution explicitly calls them people, not property, persons bound to service. The delegates who wanted to enshrine slavery as a national institution and who wanted to explicitly have it protected as a right to have property and man legitimized in the United States Constitution failed to do so. That's very important. As much as you can criticize the Founding Fathers, and I think there's plenty of room to criticize them when it comes to their treatment of slavery in particular, and their ambivalence about the institution of slavery. That was pivotal because it left the door open to reforms down the road. It left the door open to saying that the United States Constitution does not recognize the legitimacy of property and man. It simply tolerates the institution of slavery until something can be done about it down the line. This has been an issue of contention among historians for decades, you could even say centuries. Indeed, in the early abolitionist movement, we very quickly began to see a divide between the more extreme abolitionists and I'm not sure, I guess extreme is not necessarily the right word for them. You had one camp in the abolitionist movement who believed that this system established by the Constitution did not necessarily have to be a pro-slavery system. That we could take these rights and freedoms that are recognized for white people and simply expand the definition of what it is to be a citizen in the United States and include black people and include various groups within that definition. That's where figures like Frederick Douglass is a perfect example. Now, while Frederick Douglass is sometimes quoted by people in his 4th of July speech, for instance, where he asks, "What is the 4th of July to a slave?" and goes on to say that, such a holiday is meaningless to people that are bound to slavery in this supposedly free republic. When you look at his wider speeches and writings, he was someone that very much bought into the idea of America. He believed that the Constitution and the rights and freedoms in the Constitution of the United States could be expanded to include black people, and that ultimately they could become full citizens in a multiracial, multicultural democracy. On the other hand, there were other abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, who referred to the Constitution as a pact with the devil, and said that the whole thing had to be scrapped because the Constitution, because of these compromises that were made over slavery, was an immoral, pro-slavery document that was irredeemable. Ultimately, Frederick Douglass's camp would win that war of propaganda. Their position would be seen as the more popular position, the more sustainable position, and the one vindicated, at least in the view of most mainstream historians, vindicated by history. One of the most important things that happened at the Constitutional Convention was the debate over the slave trade, the importation of slaves from Africa. Many Northerners wanted to do away with the practice immediately. They saw a distinction between keeping slaves born into slavery and taking free men and forcing them into slavery. And the slave trade was becoming more and more of a target, especially among Northerners, but even among some Southerners. Take, for instance, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, in his first draft of the Declaration of Independence, heavily criticized the slave trade. Now remember, Jefferson owned more than 100 slaves. And he had, you can find quotes from Jefferson where he criticizes the institution. By and large, he opposed the trade and tolerated the institution, recognized his own hypocrisy. Jefferson's one of those figures that it's very difficult to nail him down and where he stood on anything. But we do know he was absolutely vehemently opposed to the slave trade. Many other Virginians and people from the Upper South, politicians from the Upper South, were equally opposed to the slave trade, the importation of slaves. Part of that, people argue, is economic, because they understood that if the trade was outlawed, that their property, where there was already becoming a surplus of slave labor in those states and a higher demand in the Deep South, as like we talked about before, the different types of crops they were growing was very important, that the value of those slaves that they had to sell into the internal trade in the Deep South would go way up if you could no longer cheaply import enslaved people from Africa into the country. But I think when you look at the arguments of people like Jefferson, I think it's difficult to argue that at least some of it was not sincere moral apprehension about the international slave trade. And it's the sort of thing that's somewhat difficult for me to understand in this day and age. When you talk about opposing the slave trade on moral grounds, but then being okay with the institution of slavery itself, it's difficult for us to understand. But the primary source documents, to me, indicate that that was a sincerely held belief. And in the North, of course, you had people that were anti-slavery generally, that of course also opposed the slave trade. And so there was this big debate at the Constitutional Convention as to whether this new federal government would have the authority to regulate or prohibit the slave trade. Eventually, they landed on another compromise. The slave trade, the importation of enslaved men and women from Africa, would continue. It would be allowed to continue, and Congress could not prohibit it for 20 years, although it did allow them to tax and regulate it. And then beginning on January 1st, 1808, it could be prohibited. Indeed, what ultimately happened with a coalition in Congress of Northern representatives and senators with representatives and senators from the Upper South, states like Virginia, they did pass a law in 1807 prohibiting the importation of slaves The law, interestingly, was signed into law by Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, bringing Jefferson back into the equation. One of these days I may do an episode just on Thomas Jefferson because, to me, I think he's one of the most interesting of the founders because of his hypocrisy, because of his, I'm not sure what the word for it is, his internal contradictions. Not necessarily because I believe he's the most morally upstanding or the one that we should always look up to the most, but because he's on a deeply personal level, he's the most fascinating to me. So I may do, stay tuned. Hopefully this podcast is successful in the future. I may do a standalone episode on Thomas Jefferson. One of the other things that was happening both before and after the Constitutional Convention, but especially after, as the century turned into the 1800s, the population up north was growing rapidly. The population in the South was it was growing, but not at the same rate as the North. What you start to see happen is that the House of Representatives becomes overwhelmingly controlled by representatives from northern non-slaveholding states. And that meant that the equilibrium in the Senate was so much more important. So for any listeners that are not from the United States, and I hope that this podcast begins to have a larger worldwide reach, so I really hope that I have some listeners that are not from the United States. In the American political system, we have a bicameral legislative branch of our federal government. We have the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, and that's carved out into districts, apportioned equally according to the population of those districts. That's why the North had so much more representation than the South in the House of Representatives, because it's based on population. The population was growing so much more rapidly in the North. You had, beginning in the 1800s, large waves of immigration to the North, whereas there wasn't as much immigration to the southern states. And then we have the Senate. The Senate operates a little differently. The Senate is not based on population. Rather, it's based on the states being represented. So the House of Representatives, ideologically, the idea is that the House represents the people, the Senate represents the states. Each state, regardless of its population, gets 2 senators. So as the southern slave states lost their grip on the House of Representatives, the Senate became even more important. So as the country expanded westward, it was increasingly important to the southern states that new free states not be admitted faster than slave states. And this led to great contention, again, over the issue of the spread of slavery. Many Northerners who were becoming increasingly anti-slavery at this time did not want the institution of slavery to continue to spread west. Southerners understood that if slavery was contained where it existed and was not allowed to expand, that they would eventually be outnumbered and overpowered by a coalition of free states in the Senate, who could then use their supremacy in both the House and the Senate to pass national legislation to limit or abolish slavery. And essentially what I didn't say before, so let me go back and just say, for those of you that aren't American, in order to pass any law in the United States, in the federal government, it has to pass both the House and the Senate and then be signed by the president. I think most other functioning democracies have similar systems, although I know some have unicameral legislatures where there's only one house, there's only one parliament, there's not an upper and a lower house. But that's the way it functions in the United States. You have the House of Representatives, the Senate. Legislation has to pass both and be signed by the president. The president has veto power. That's just a basic civics lesson for anyone that doesn't know that. So that was just one of many reasons that as the 1800s progressed, pro-slavery forces, or what I like to call, and I didn't make this term up, this is commonly used by historians, but I really like it, is the slaveocracy in the southern state, the rule by slave owners in the southern states. These forces began to feel increasingly that they were on the defensive. Because while most Northerners were not abolitionists at this time, by about 1840, the majority of Northerners were united in anti-slavery sentiments. And it's important to distinguish between an anti-slavery position and an abolitionist position. Anti-slavery could include a broad spectrum of beliefs and policies, including simply limiting the spread of slavery, but not necessarily favoring abolishing the institution itself. In fact, many Northerners were intensely racist at this time and did not want slavery to be abolished because they feared that if black people were to become free, they could then move north and compete in the labor market with free white workers, and that they would be underbid, and especially poor white people in the North would suffer. This was a widely held belief at the time. But most people were against the spread of slavery into new states. Because while they were racist, there was a commonly held belief that, yes, black people are inferior, but they're still people. And it goes against our values as a country. These values from the Declaration of Independence to have us be primarily a slave-holding country. It was seen as contradictory. It was understood as contradictory. Additionally, you had many people who could be called anti-slavery who favored something like what was done in the northern states, some kind of gradual, compensated emancipation of slaves. An abolitionist position, it's important to note, very specifically called for the immediate and uncompensated freedom and emancipation of all people enslaved in the United States. And there were varying degrees of extremism on that front and different opinions as to how that would be done. But that's the important distinction of the abolitionist movement. They wanted it immediately abolished. Slavery was never legitimate. They were always people. They were never property. And this institution never had any legitimacy. It doesn't have any legitimacy now. It should be abolished immediately. That's the abolitionist position. Most Northerners by the 1840s were anti-slavery. The vast majority of Northerners were not abolitionists in the 1840s. The abolitionists were still a very fringe movement in 1840. However, this growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North, as well as the fact that they were outnumbered by Northerners in the House of Representatives, made the Southern slaveocracy anxious that their institution, their peculiar institution, as they called it, and that doesn't refer to it as a weird institution, but rather that it's an institution peculiar to the Southern states, meaning it's only practiced there. And they didn't like to use the word slavery because slavery was seen as not genteel. So they would come up with euphemisms. The most popular euphemism was our peculiar institution. They were outnumbered in the House, and so it was important to maintain equilibrium in the Senate, and they felt like they were constantly on the defensive to make sure that new states, as they were added, that there was always one slave state, that they could not afford to be outnumbered by free states. And so you end up with this political divide and things like the Missouri Compromise in 1820, where Missouri was allowed to enter as a slave state, and the modern state of Maine was carved out of part of what was then Massachusetts and made into another free state, so that we maintained that equilibrium. There were a number of other reasons that the slaveocracy in the southern states believed that their institution was under threat by 1840. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, and most importantly, in the 1830s, the British Empire abolished slavery in their colonies in the Caribbean, what was then known as the British West Indies. The British had outlawed the slave trade right around the same time that the Americans did. So the importation of slaves was illegitimate in the British Empire, and I would say that the anti-slavery forces in the British government were much more powerful and influential than they were in the United States. Increasingly after 1808, the British became increasingly anti-slavery, including the majority of the British public. For a couple of decades, the plantocracy or slaveocracy from these Caribbean islands, principally Jamaica, but also the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, other colonies that were British in the Caribbean, managed to hold enough power in the British government and sway to prevent the abolition of slavery. But then in 1831, there was a massive slave revolt in Jamaica, the largest of Britain's slave colonies in the Caribbean. It was led by an enslaved Baptist preacher named Samuel Sharp, and it was participated in by approximately 60,000 enslaved Jamaicans. It started as a peaceful strike. The enslaved Jamaicans were not demanding their freedom, even. They were simply striking to demand better working conditions and more rights within the system of chattel slavery. This began on Christmas, 1831, December 25th. Crucially, that was an important time of the season in harvesting sugarcane, which was the primary crop produced in Jamaica. And so the authorities in Jamaica attempted to use force to force these striking slaves back to work. The attempt by the authorities to force an end to the strike turned the strike into a riot. The riot became a full-blown revolt. And the local militias, this was in the area of Montego Bay on the north shore of Jamaica, could not on their own put down this rebellion. So they called up the militias from the planters all around the island. They called on the very small garrison of regular British troops that was stationed in Jamaica, commanded by Lord Willoughby, who coalesced all of the planter militias under his command, and importantly also called up the militias from the Maroon communities of the cockpit country, the interior. The Maroon communities refer to communities of free black Jamaicans who initially in the 1700s were communities of runaway slaves that had run away from plantations along the coast into the interior of the island and formed their own communities. They fought two wars for their freedom against the British government in the 1700s. The British could not put them down. The British could not force them back into slavery, and ultimately came to the negotiating table with them. The settlement that was agreed on to put an end to these, they're known as the Maroon Wars, was essentially that the British would recognize as legitimate the freedom of these Maroon communities, and in return the Maroon communities would be incorporated into the colonial society as British subjects. Part of that being that they had to have militias that would answer the call of the governor when called upon to, among other things, put down slave rebellions. And so in 1831, Christmas 1831, when Samuel Sharp's rebellion erupted, what came to be known as the Baptist War, these Maroon militias answered the call. Indeed, the first engagement of the Baptist War was a battle between the rebel slaves and the Maroon militias. And the Maroon militia was soundly defeated and forced to withdraw. Outnumbered and outmanned, they realized that they could not defeat the rebellion on their own. So they retreated and regrouped and joined forces with the planter militia and with the regular British forces on the island. And once these forces coalesced and came up with a unified strategy to put down the rebellion, they did so pretty quickly and very brutally. In the aftermath of the rebellion, it's thought that approximately 500 enslaved Jamaicans were tried and hanged, including the leader, Samuel Sharp. Samuel Sharp is today remembered as a national hero of Jamaica. There's a statue of him in Montego Bay that you can go and see. It's in one of the main squares. Until 2023, he was depicted on the Jamaican $50 bill. And from 2023 on, apparently, he was on the 50 the last time I was in Jamaica, but apparently from 2023 on, they moved him to the $500 bill. He's a national hero of Jamaica. He's seen as one of the founders of Jamaica, as a martyr, because he was hanged by British authorities in Jamaica in the aftermath of the Baptist War. It's reported that his last words were that I would rather die on the gallows up yonder than to live my life in slavery. In the aftermath of this rebellion, the British government sent a delegation to Jamaica to investigate this rebellion, its causes, and what should be done about it. The results of this investigation revealed the brutality with which the enslaved population of Jamaica and the wider Caribbean were treated by the British planters and slave owners on the islands. In addition, in the aftermath of the Baptist War, many white Baptist missionaries were arrested and harassed. Some were tarred and feathered by mobs of planters. And the images of this to the British public, which was, while they were more anti-slavery than the American public, this was still the 1800s. The British public was pretty racist by modern standards. But it seems that the images of white Baptist missionaries who were seen by the planters on Jamaica as having been complicit in the rebellion, because as I said, Samuel Sharp himself was an enslaved Baptist preacher. These white Baptist missionaries were seen as complicit in the rebellion, and they were brutalized by the Jamaican slaveocracy. It seems that this rebellion in Jamaica spurred the abolitionist movement in Parliament to action. It won much of the public and therefore their representatives over to the cause of abolition, seeing the brutality with which it was put down. And beyond that, I think there was a practical element. I think that the British authorities were very fearful of something like the Haitian Revolution, which had happened a generation before, when the French colonial authority in Haiti had been overthrown by, it's an oversimplification to call it a slave rebellion, but essentially an alliance of free black and mixed race people with the enslaved population to overthrow the colonial authority and eventually establish independence. And I think the British authorities saw the writing on the wall at this point. When you look at the population of these Caribbean islands, the enslaved population vastly outnumbered the free population, and especially the free white population on these islands by a lot. We didn't really have anything that's comparable in the United States. In the United States, the only state where the enslaved population ever outnumbered the free white population was South Carolina. Take Jamaica at this time period, for instance. It's estimated that approximately 80% of the population of the island was enslaved. And so to the British, this rebellion of 1831-32 was a wake-up call. They realized that the institution of slavery was not sustainable if they wanted to maintain their sovereignty over their colonies in the Caribbean. And so in 1833, as a response largely, not directly, but indirectly as a response to this rebellion in Jamaica, the British Parliament passed the Act of Abolition to take effect on August 1st, 1834. This did not immediately end slavery. It certainly didn't end white supremacy in the Caribbean. It was a gradual, compensated emancipation, similar to what was done in many northern states of the U.S. The slaves were to be freed over a period of 6 years. During those 6 years, they would not be slaves. They would have rights. They would be citizens, but they would still be bound to service to their former owners, in what was called an apprenticeship. In the years following this, the slaveocracy in Jamaica and other islands of the Caribbean attempted to corruptly turn this apprentice system into a system of slavery in all but name. And so in 1838, when it became clear that the apprentice system was unworkable, the British government again stepped in and simply abolished slavery. Although it was still compensated. The former slave owners in the Caribbean, many of whom were absentee slave owners who did not actually live in the Caribbean but lived in England, and some of whom were members of Parliament, were compensated for the loss of their property. So going back to the big picture, what you see is this southern slaveocracy in the United States that sees themselves surrounded by anti-slavery enemies. and they felt as though they were constantly on the defensive, that the institution of slavery constantly had to be defended, and that they were not able to make moves to proactively spread and strengthen the institution because they constantly had to defend it from outside enemies, or outside agitators, as some like to say. The institution of race-based chattel slavery had existed in the Caribbean alongside that of the United States for decades. And when you talk about something going back to the coastwise slave trade, if a ship was wrecked or was forced to land in one of these British Caribbean ports, they still had slavery. So there was no danger that British officials would interfere with the institution of slavery. After they abolished slavery, not only did you have free territory right off the shore of the southern United States along these trade routes, you had free territory that was primarily populated by freed slaves, former slaves, freedmen. And you had a British government that not only had abolished slavery, but was increasingly taking steps at being anti-slavery, especially when it came to combating the slave trade on the high seas. The British had attempted to get the Americans to sign a treaty to treat slave traders on the high seas as pirates, essentially a crime that was punishable by execution. The Americans ultimately did not sign this treaty, but that's what the British were trying to do at this point. The British, having abolished slavery, now became not just a neutral power, but an anti-slavery power. And they were right off the coast, right along the trade routes. Overnight, these fellow travelers who had once been a slaveocracy were now an enemy. They were an anti-slavery enemy that posed a threat to the institution. So at this point, you have Northerners, the majority of whom were anti-slavery, though not abolitionist, with a distinct advantage in the House of Representatives. You had an uneasy equilibrium in the Senate. To the north of these southern states, you had these northern states that were free states. Off the coast and to the southwest, you had the British West Indies and Mexico, which had abolished slavery. The British had become particularly anti-slavery during this time. And you can see why the southern slaveocracy felt that they were on the defensive to defend their institutions. At this point, they were really relying on the presidency to make sure that no one who was anti-slavery was elected president, and on the Supreme Court. And on that last note, there was a general feeling that they could trust the Supreme Court to protect what they saw as their property rights, unequivocally. Then in 1839, there was a case out of the Supreme Court, United States versus the Amistad. If you've seen the 1997 Steven Spielberg movie Amistad, you may know a little about this story. That movie has a lot of historical inaccuracies in the minutia, but it's a favorite of mine. I'm a fan of it. And I think that even though it has a lot of inaccuracies, particularly when it comes to the legal procedures and in the court case, that it captures the spirit of what happened and the spirit of the time. In early July 1839, there was a ship called La Amistad that departed Havana, Cuba for Puerto Príncipe. And I know my Spanish pronunciation is bad. I'm doing my best. Please bear with me. That's going to be true as I move deeper into this podcast and talk about history in other parts of the world. Please bear with my mispronunciations. I'm going to do my best. Anyway, the ship was sailing from Havana to Puerto Príncipe, carrying 55 captive Mende Africans. That's important. These were not enslaved men and women that were born in Cuba. They had been captured in Africa and illegally transported across the Atlantic. And this was the second leg of their voyage. After they were sold at market in Havana, they were to be brought to another part of Cuba where they would begin working as slaves. In early July, the captives on the Amistad rose up, killed the captain, and took control of the ship. The two men who purportedly owned them, who had purchased them in Havana with full knowledge of their origins, were Pedro Montez and Jose Ruiz. These two men were on board the ship. They agreed, in exchange for their lives, to navigate the ship back to Africa. But they lied. They told the captives that they were sailing the ship back to Africa to set them free. Instead, they sailed the ship north into U.S. territorial waters, hoping to be rescued, and that they could re-enslave the captives and retain their property. A couple of months later, the ship was intercepted by the predecessor to the U.S. Coast Guard. It wasn't called the Coast Guard yet at this time, but for all intents and purposes, it was the Coast Guard. It was intercepted off the coast of Long Island and brought to shore in New Haven, Connecticut. This led to a long and complicated court battle, which I won't recount all of the details of here, but let me at least lay out the parties to give you a picture of what was going on in the court case here. You had officers of the U.S. Coast Guard who claimed the ship and its cargo, including the captive Africans, as their property lawfully salvaged on the high seas. Montez and Ruiz claimed the Africans as their rightful slave property. The Spanish consul, in the name of the Spanish government, claimed that all the property from the Amistad, including the Africans, must be returned to its rightful Spanish owners, Montez and Ruiz, pursuant to a 1795 treaty with the United States. The U.S. attorney in Connecticut took the position that Spain had presented them papers documenting that these Africans were not actually African, that they were rightfully enslaved people born in Cuba, and that they were the property of Montez and Ruiz. And they took the position that because these papers existed, the court was not allowed to investigate further, pursuant to the treaty, even though the overwhelming amount of the evidence in the case showed that these men and women were Mende Africans. They were Mende people from West Africa that had been illegally kidnapped and sold into slavery. The official position of the U.S. government was that the court had to ignore that outside evidence because the Spanish had provided documents that said otherwise. And then, of course, the final party were the African captives themselves, who were represented by an attorney played masterfully by Matthew McConaughey in the 1997 film, hired by local abolitionists to represent them. And their contention was, of course, that they were never slaves. They were free men, illegally kidnapped and sold into slavery, and that they had the right to rise up and defend themselves and assert their freedom, including with violence. Ultimately, the lower court agreed with them. They were set free, and the lower court ordered them freed immediately and without delay, and that they be, at the expense of the U.S. government, taken back to their homes in Africa. This was appealed by the U.S. government to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court affirmed the ruling of the lower court in a 7-1 decision, including with the vote of 3 slaveholding justices, that these men were not slaves and they must be set free. It's difficult to understate the importance of this decision, not necessarily to the law, because the law was pretty clear on this matter. That's why it was a 7-1 decision. The one dissent was not even a written dissent. Just one of the justices noted his dissent and did not write an opinion. The law was very clear. But the dialogue about this case, what it added to the dialogue about slavery and the apprehensions of the Southern slavocracy that their institution was under attack, it's difficult to understate that. The Southern slavocracy was outraged by this decision. Many Northerners were likewise outraged by this decision. There's undoubtedly very racist elements in the North at this time. And the way this was seen by many in the press is that these black men, these savage Africans, as they saw them, had risen up and murdered white men, and that the U.S. justice system had allowed them to get away with it. But beyond that, the case affirmed into law that black people were people and not property, that there was nothing inherent about the enslavement of black people, that slavery was something created by man-made law, that it was not the natural order of things, that in fact, despite their race, these captives on board the Amistad were free men entitled to the same rights and privileges, including the right to self-defense, that any white man had. This flew in the face of, while it was not the law, the prevailing theory used by the Southern slaveocracy to justify slavery, which is that slavery, the enslavement of black people, is the natural order of things. That it's meant to be, that it's ordained by God. And you see that it was a very common belief among the advocates of slavery. One of the most influential politicians of the time, John C. Calhoun, would echo these beliefs. 20 years later, in his famous Cornerstone speech, the vice president of the Confederacy, in defending the Confederate cause of secession to preserve and expand the institution of slavery, he talked about Jefferson's idea that all men are created equal, and that while slavery could be tolerated, it's inherently evil. And he called this, quote, an error. He went on to say that, quote, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, are his natural and normal condition. The ruling in the Amistad case from the Supreme Court rejected this idea. It said that slavery is not the natural and normal condition of any person on the basis of their race. Rather, freedom is the natural and normal condition of all men, and that free men have a right to use violence. Free black men have a right to use violence to defend themselves from slavery against white men. It wasn't terribly radical from a legal standpoint. That was how the law was written. The Supreme Court made the right decision. It was difficult to argue otherwise on legal grounds, but on philosophical grounds, the South was outraged. And it was yet one more reason that they felt that their peculiar institution of slavery was under attack from all sides, and that they had lost the Supreme Court. It's important to say that when the Creole affair unfolded in 1841, slavery was not actually under threat. There was no legitimate threat to the institution of slavery at the time. Even most Northern politicians, whereas the Northern public was largely anti-slavery, for most people it wasn't the most important issue, and most Northern politicians were content to go along to get along. They preferred to ignore slavery, or to compromise on slavery, to kick the can further down the road and not deal with it right now. They were willing to tolerate and even empower the Southern slaveocracy in order to maintain the unity of the country between North and South. But many slave-owning Southerners at this point began to see the writing on the wall. They were very fearful that they would be overpowered by an anti-slavery coalition that could threaten their livelihoods and the very structure of their society, and the very core belief about what they believed about themselves and their society, as we talked about. They believed that slavery was ordained by God, and it was the natural and normal condition of black people. And to have that belief about their society that they were raised in challenged made many of them defensive. And they put great pressure on the federal government to defend slavery from outside forces. And that is the political situation in which these rebellious slaves on board the Creole rose up and asserted their liberty. There are differing accounts of what happened next on board the Creole. According to some witness accounts, William Merritt, one of the slaves' guards, was taken prisoner by the rebels, and he agreed to navigate the ship for them in exchange for his life. And these accounts say that initially Washington and his lieutenants wanted him to navigate the ship to sail to Liberia, which had been set up as a colony for freed slaves on the coast of West Africa at this time. Merritt convinced them that they didn't have enough provisions on board the ship in order to sail that far, and that they would have to sail somewhere much closer, and he suggested Nassau in the Bahamas, which was not too far away. Nassau was part of the British West Indies, where slavery had been abolished 3 years before, in 1838. Other accounts differ. They agree that Merritt agreed to navigate the ship in exchange for his life, but they say that Nassau in the Bahamas was always the destination that Madison Washington and his lieutenants had in mind. That they were well aware that there had been previous shipwrecks and situations where ships on the coastwise slave trade had landed in the British West Indies, and those enslaved on those ships had been set free. They had heard these rumors, and that was true. That had happened. It's unclear what that conversation looked like, what exactly was said, by who. What is clear is that the decision was made that they would set sail for Nassau in the Bahamas. They sailed toward an uncertain future. Those enslaved, or who had been enslaved on the Creole prior to the rebellion, had to have felt tremendous anxiety and uncertainty about their future. While they probably knew that slavery had been abolished in the British Empire, they also knew that this situation was different. They were not going to be shipwrecked there. They were going to be sailing into the harbor after forcibly seizing control of the ship. At least one white man was killed. It appeared at the time that another, Captain Ensor, would die because he was so severely wounded. And they couldn't have been sure how they would be received. They might be freed by the British. The British could also hang them as pirates, or they could extradite them and turn them back over to their American enslavers. As the sun rose on November 8, 1841, they must have felt simultaneously hopeful and fearful of what the future might hold. Thank you all for listening. That's everything for today. Please tune in next time for episode 2 of the History Sphere, where we will explore what happens next as the Creole arrives in Nassau Harbor and is intercepted by British authorities, and they become the object at the center of an international dispute between the United States and the United Kingdom. We'll also explore the diplomatic history and the diplomatic situation, giving the wider context to the Anglo-American relationship in the early 1840s. It's going to be really exciting. I'd like to give a big thank you and shout out to the Blake Annex for helping to provide me with this podcast studio and the space that I'm using to record this podcast. Angelique and Ketty from the Blake Annex were particularly helpful and supportive. I hope you all enjoyed this. Please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating if you liked what you heard and you're looking forward to the next chapter in the story. It's really going to help us get this podcast established. Thank you. Thank you all.